Hello everyone, today we talk about the Germanic Gefolgschaft / Comitatus in a more comprehensive way than the ones we have done before. Made lots of videos about, say, the Comitatus proper, but especially the adoption per arma. We talked about, also in the Celtic world, about the Fiannas. We talked a lot about ancient warbands especially. It's really important to focus on the Germanic warbands to understand so much from the entire Indo-European ones, thanks to the fact that for the Germans who have this privileged level of documentation, for which were peoples who were already literate and sort of ethnographically versed, that could document the transition of the Germans essentially from a literally prehistorical primitive people into something more feudally chivalric, etc. And especially, in fact, for our series about medieval knighthood, appreciating how much, in fact, of that traditional reality survived not just in the German Middle Ages, for example, and we will surely expand much on that, but in fact in the rest of medieval chivalry. And you know that, in fact, we treat this as a pretty, the more it becomes, of course, like a knightly issue, of course, pertains to the entire West and beyond. However, the transformation, the way things came to be and modifying themselves and religiously and spiritually re-elaborated is particularly relevant. So it's important to revisit the vital question of such values at the root of the entire, I would say, Western civilization. This is not just about politics or state building or just the military or how you see an army passing from a tribal context to a, in fact, more advanced one. This gets down to very hardcore issues that must be understood also in the context of the era, and of course outside especially of our own, because they were truly universal. And today we have been trained to think that essentially they were sort of fragmentary and non-Catholic in nature. This is incredibly wrong and false under any historical religious point of view. Now, what common ground do the concepts of wildness and community, for example, share? This is an important question that we witness every day, because you know that in the traditional organic of the Catholic Empire, there is not a simple obedience of the community to the system per se. In order to be successful, such force must constantly wrestle with the lower elements that are actually quite dangerous, and as you know, rotting at the root the entire basis, the entire foundation of power, of divinity, and that actually allows for this constant sacrifice in fire and blood, which is at the end of the day what entering a Gefolgschaft, a Comitatus, was about. We talk a lot, of course, about the warrior beasts, the berserker, the ulfednar, etc. We'll come back on those, of course, but those are very pertinent to the topic because they show you how these people were actually initiated, what role they had in their communities, and what the entire transfigurational point of such enterprise really was. We will see it better today. And so how the entire thing is intertwined. So apparently, what we tend to see as contrasting beliefs or political positions today are actually part of the dialectic of the paradigm, if of course you manage to maintain the helm, navigating yourself through incredibly perilous waters, which is the ultimate point of the imperial evangelic apostolical mission. Now, at the core of this exploration lies, of course, even the most crude ferocity and intense emotions that define, for example, the Knights of the Chanson, that, as we've seen in many videos, are not simply what the more idealized version of the saying, especially from the third quarter of the 12th century, began sort of to depict them like, mostly for regulatory reasons. But of course, an incredible struggle in itself, a painstaking effort for essentially a liberation, or an elevation from the human mortal condition. This battle continues despite centuries of refinement, influenced, for example, in the High Middle Ages by the Cluniac and Cistercian spirituality. Think about the Nova Militia by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the temple, the meaning that has, for example, towards the church, towards the priesthood, right, and the Ghibelline ideal. We will talk more about that, because that contrast, albeit reciprocal support, at the same time, this is the crucial aspect, between church and empire is vital for the divine power itself. Look at what happened in Constantinople, and look at what happened in Western Europe. Constantinople sclerotized, right? Everybody was obedient, yes, but what did this bring to compared to a West where the papacy and the empire were literally at times at war with each other, albeit never disconfessing one another as necessary universal authorities. Now, additionally, and that of course gets to the ultimate point of how that had come to happen. It's not that unity should not exist, but how are humans worked at a certain point to make it actually work, and what is actually needed in order to reinforce that bond. That's the decline. That's why, of course, the Byzantines had still, of course, with Christianity, unavoidably separation between church and state, which contemporary people do not understand. They think that they've been told by sort of post-traditional ideology that, having a church and a state that sort of recognize one another, of course, are in tandem, is not a separation between church and state. Definitionally, with Christianity, when there is a church, that's something that the state is not, right? So just think of how dialectically we've been fooled to think like major pillars of Western civilization in a diametrically opposite way, not just in a theoretical opinion, but literally in the historical reality of how it was. Never mind this aspect of how, of course, humans fell short of the capacity of having a ruler. There is also the head of the church, you could argue. In any case, what is needed to come back to that is definitely not something that simply sclerotizes the system further, like saying, well, okay, we stick formally to that, but there is no substance to it, as a matter of fact, and we actually lose power to somebody else. Remember always the Augustinian principle, there is no such thing like evil. Evil is the absence of good. There is no such thing like a secondary force, and believe Augustine, that was raised a dualistic, heretic of Manichaeism, that consciously said that's the actual scam, right? There is no such thing like a secondary force that ultimately at that point we should simply depend on. It's us. It's all on us, right? And this actually reinforced dramatically the imperial and say the imperial necessity of men elevating oneself to divine standards, which is what is criticized, that misunderstood in the sense of the church having allegedly obstacled in just for the fact that it posed herself against the emperor or the imperial action on different occasions. That's absolutely not what that meant at all, right? And also the empire and the papacy at some point the humanity fall, and still in a West that was the one that Catholically had nailed it differently from the rest of the world, also by prophecy gradually degenerate, without other people outside of it actually achieving anything, even remotely comparable to even the outcome of this in the West, by positivity. Now, aside from this, what really sustains the deep sense of friendship and fellowship in the Comitatus is also what intrigued the same Christian writers, right, that were documenting such military bonds. In fact, the latter are a veritable cornerstone of chivalric ethos and sensibility, which are inherently social in a universal sense, despite in fact the modern individualistic interpretations that reduce tales of errant knights to mere fantasies. If you open a normal, say, conventional, let's put it in this way, book of even, I don't know, we talked about animal symbolism during the Middle Ages, from the bestiaries, etc., and or literature. Most of these works in the last generations, maybe not the very last one, but in general, right, are just describing you, oh look, this guy did that, it's so complex, it's difficult to understand, and no explanation is given for what instead for generations and generations we have written about, and also from very, say, modern updated historiography from the 19th, from the 20th century that told you, like, literally, this is what the thing means. It's as if they shifted completely the attention from what the archetypal meaning was to, let's just think that this guy existed and wrote this stuff because it's interesting and in his time he would think about this thing, but let's not focus on why or what these things actually mean. This is really the current mainstay of the academia on these topics. Yes, of course, the specialists are aware. The general, say, there are people who study these traditional meanings, but say, for example, in a general literary landscape, normally those who specialize in those fields are not necessarily, they do not understand history of religion. They're not necessarily equipped with even just the historical, right? History of literature is very different from history in general. Background that is needed to study certain things, and basically every idiot puts something together today and manages to publish it because it's written in a sort of passable English and sort of being structured around certain thoughts that he comes up with for speaking of, let's reevaluate, let's see things in perspective, gets published. That's also why current publications at large are rubbish and garbage, but that's also how this dilutes the actual understanding of this meaning, without even talking about the instances in which these topics are not discussed, because those who have a vague idea of what they actually mean want to absolutely deviate the attention from tradition. There is also this other approach, like considering culturalism, which basically says that only barbarians make war, which is evidently not true. I mean, everybody makes war. And yes, there are barbarians, and there are peoples who are underdeveloped and cannot make war, and are dumb and make stupid decisions. But it turns out that, in fact, the greatest powers in the world are, and the ones who actually are, and by capable of waging war by scale successfully, are actually the single most destructively, equipped, let's say, powers in the world. The civilization develops in parallel with the increase of its destruction capacity. And this is not to say in terms of mere threat or, just because we have nuclear weapons. We're talking in terms of the capacity of waging war with an actual success, and not as amateurs that just think the military instrument to be there to be spent for whichever contingental reason comes into their mind. I'm not even going to discuss culturalism. Just warn you that it left a mark in the study of military history. The new military history especially was very guilty of culturalism, which is not even to be believed, because most people, as I said before, do not even get themselves into the theory of the art of war, or understanding why the culturalism is wrong the authors that came up with it have never opened the Formkrieg in their lives, even though they have a lot of opinions on von Clausewitz, and they say sort of the most incredibly uninformed nonsense. You immediately understand they have never studied it. There is no doubt whatsoever. But it also left this vaguely, again, destructive tendency of saying, let's study war, but let's study it in the light of the culture, because it's not just war, it's how this has repercussions in society. You must understand, as if warfare was just in function of society, right? That's not the case. You must study warfare, yes, together with society and politics, but understanding that they're all the reflection of one another, and they always cooperate at the same time. So you cannot separate the two things. In other words, you cannot understand how society works if you do not know how armies fought concretely, not like on, YouTube videos other than mine. Of course, I specialize in the art of war, and I'm warning you, what is made out there by other YouTube channels, even though getting, of course, overwhelmingly larger amount of views than mine for obvious reasons of visual effects, whatever, is absolutely not what we study as literally a handful of people in the world as the art of war. I mean, not even saying the theory of the art of war, because that, of course, comes to be, but how does it, right? If you don't study pretty much everything military wise. Consider that people come here and say, oh my god, Schwerpunkt, you make so many videos. Is it all you make at Similia? It doesn't take me anything to do this. This is just to train the muscles, making them always fit and ready for use. I publish for a living, right? So that means articles with thousands of citations that take months to write. You must be within this, not just sort of doing it spontaneously. That's in a sense, military-wise, all I do. Because wherever I go, whatever I do, with wherever I am, and whatever happens, I am living within this world, mentally speaking. So I am in this condition from decades now, so I take pride of what I do, but I also recognize that you must always work, that there is no other way for being reliable otherwise. So you have already seen in the other videos I made on these topics that the Germanic Comitatus, etc., that we're forced, if anything, because we do not, of course, have all the information that we would like, even about the relatively well-documented Germans, to draw parallels with ritual practices, initiation rites, magical religious beliefs. Tradition is not obvious. It's something you must reconstruct, looking at so many different hints scattered everywhere. And that's what I was saying before. They have specifically wanted you to stop doing this work, because once you spot the pattern, for them, at least for those who do not want you to have particular beliefs, it's over. Right? So they want to, it's easy not to make you do that because it takes a long time, but once it kicks in, you can't quite stop. So this forces us to, for example, revisit the legacy of Germanic religious tradition. Let's stop using the term paganism, because it doesn't mean anything. These were all Catholic peoples, all right? Before and after Christianity. Paganism was the fractal, subhuman, chthonic, superstitious dimension of these words that these people deeply loathed to begin with. And let's see how this, in fact, Uranian dimension that, however, as we said at the beginning, always needs that substratum, that telluric substratum, to remold it and coming back to the Catholic one, was to be found woven into the fabric of medieval Christianity, Western Christianity especially. And this is why Roman Catholicism is so violently necessary for any person who wants to be a person to begin with. Now, what stands out about the Germanic customs? I recently made a video about the imperial Catholic miracle of these peoples, compelling a comparison with the mentality and practices of chivalry and imperial Ghibelline chivalry, is of course and unavoidably the sacred dimension of warfare. There is a very specific point to a warband in Catholic tradition. This involves social groups of warriors marked by initiatory characteristics that are not just, matter of the individual guy opinion there. These groups position themselves dialectically, of course, with their tribal societies, exactly because they have a Catholic purpose, but sometimes, and to a degree always, becoming distinct entities. In this sense, rupturing their connections, whilst never entirely detaching from them. Study also Christian monasticism. Look at what the monastic military orders actually were, what it means to be a monk, what it means to establish a monastery in the reflection of heavenly perfection on earth, and not absolutely the escape from the world or the separation from the world. Only lesser people live paranoidly at the fringes of the world because they're not able to self-actualize themselves into actual imperial power manifestation and world domination. Remember that, neo-pagans of my boots, that there is no greater honor but to rule the world entire and be one with God. For the Germanic warrior, who derives strength and aggressiveness from initiatory practices and forges bonds with peers and respected leaders, the camaraderie formed through shared values, a common destiny, and a ritualistic brotherhood coexists with his natural familial ties, the Sippe. Not fully. The problem here was the extreme that they could arrive to sacrifice. Infinitely, had that happened, they would have become truly gods. However, the awareness of these peoples, since the time you can document them historically, was actually the one of realization of a human shortcoming. As a matter of fact, peoples like the Germans, the Celts, did not really have that fully Apollonian understanding that the Hellenes, that the Romans had matured, if anything, because they had remained at the fringes of the world, and they understood, of course, that there were powerful empires out there that were much greater than them. So this sense of underdogs that literally you can identify in the Ulfednars, in the sense that you need to atone for your sins, passing through this veritable ritual death in order to be reborn into a higher status, is necessary for them. In fact, not just to survive, like creating these bands of essentially elite nature, at least aspirationally, and often, right, reaching that level for saving their own tribe. We've seen the Lugi, entire peoples were able to perform such a ritual sacrifice of themselves. The point was always, yes, how, to which extent? Because the ultimate purpose was, of course, victory over the world, over the mortal condition, and so reachieving a divine power. That is always something that manifests earthly, because the earth must be transcended itself, right, within this heroic deed. There is an important question, of course, concerning the Sippe as well, because it's not like even in ritual death, during the initiatic entrance in the warband, you were devoid of a bodily dimension. The point was altering the same, psychophysically, of course, like the spirit achieves that, but it could not happen without the matter that is inextricably connected to it. That's why dualists are against this principle of power and order. I made, of course, a video recently that was very much watched about how, late medieval heresies were designed specifically for doing this, and I'm still appalled to see how many people that, of course, do not know my work, but just in their average life literally believe that, this is, they're completely unaware because they have no idea that this is the case, not one case made by someone. This is the entire point in which the entire is religion, right? There are not religions, there is only one, right? Or at least religions can be understood as the ways in which you're tied to this greater purpose that is the same for everyone, right? So the Zippe brought the soma, the blood, the cannon fodder, the sacrificial lamb for such warbands that, as you know, ritually killed some of their members, the weaker ones, exactly to refresh the blood, to re-exalt the spirit, and to necessarily derive force from this sacrifice, when this was at least bringing down the quality of the warband, and so it was actually a failure of the same, but necessitated a bloodshed in order to re-equilibrate it, which is actually, say, death at this point doesn't matter and does not exist, because once you have entered the warband, you as a person do not exist. You're just a more or less undistinguishable part of the warband, as we'll see better now. And so it's not much of a pity the fact that you die per se, because you're spiritually tied to something that lives on, and so that can impart further self-sacrifice to refresh. Equally, the same individual that is part of this, at least in our materialistic vision of this of the story, in the moment in which he is, of course, tested in order to enter this sacred warband, is of course losing something in the process. Must be wounded, must be beaten, psychophysically traumatized in any way to properly cancel from his head that he exists as a human being, because nobody needs human beings, right? We need only God. So such warrior bond tends to transcend the Zippe, at least. The Zippe, as you know, is we have the Zippe and the Comitatus as, in fact, like respectively the agricultural villager world that still does go at war with the levy, with militias, and with the chieftains, with their retinues that are in theory the same war bands, but also you have these being, as we'll see now, a bit more apolid and not living for the Zippe per se, but roaming around and searching, in fact, for, as errant knights, this heavenly glory, participating in the great baths of blood that the quite turbulent Germanic landscape offers quite frequently. In the constant effort to strengthen themselves, to become ever more elite, closer to God in the extension of their dominion and in fact, capacity to transfigure. Thus, the Comitatus, held together by the warrior bond, and of course also their hierarchical aspect, because the leader is the medium with the divinity, and so we will see this now, but sometimes, of course, opposes the Zippe. You are meant to send your son out there learning what the word is about. Some really get pretty hardcore into this as warrior beasts and properly secluded from the rest of society, because they are the ones who are plunging into the darkest pit of hell in order to come back out of it and being able to spring back towards heaven, if they have been strong enough to survive that ordeal. That's also, in a sense, how in the moment of the evangelization, such political and military capacity was somehow challenged, in the sense that at least the berserkers and the Ulfenars were eventually put down by the same societies that had created them. Tolkien, of course, much later, because the knight is just a continuation of that, but it's one that functions more effectively, given the magnitude of power that has been imperially revived at the point. It doesn't need quite a tribal system anymore. And what is important is that, of course, the Comitatus continues, in spite of these tensions, to coexist with the Zippe. It couldn't be otherwise, because, as we said, the imperial dimension cannot do without the support also of the lower crawling world, the one at contact with the dirt, with blood, with the dead, the fallen, because the sense is to rejuvenate, to reinvigorate, to resuscitate and resurrect this through the higher level bloodshed. Right? Remember, it's not just by stepping into a mine that you into a holy war that you go to heaven. You must actually win, and and even if you die gloriously in that sense, your soul will transcend the earthly dimension, but will not be able to, just by the fact of losing your life, not necessarily even the battle in that sense, just obtain that much that can be put into circulation in the end time for the last struggle to defend the holy citadel, right? But the others are somehow lost. Yet there is always this idea that nobody gets fully lost, and that everything in getting back to the one can be resurrected and resuscitated. This is why these warriors are fighting. Now, more specifically, the warrior, in Germanic societies, we're talking pre-Christian times roughly, but again, this continues well after that through the military practice of also the rest of the world, would seek to balance his loyalty to the inherent system of family and tribe with his allegiance to the more artificial values, so we could say, that arise from choice and rigorous training, which he shares with his Comitatus leaders and comrades during their youthful experiences as warriors. This is really relatable. We all know that as teenagers we went through that phase. We like to be in gangs, we like to beat, we like to bond in that sense of heightened, adrenalinic state, which has to do with dominance, with clienteles, with power sharing, with dependency, and all this stuff. We're genetically designed to do so, and especially men, of course, so that even bullying, etc., has minimally, at least to a level of camaraderie that doesn't exceed into crime, albeit you can argue to a degree that can be useful as well, have a specific traditional role, right? The concept, especially of human sacrifice, is quite interesting. Again, we live in a world in which, of course, we can't do this because we realize that given our current human condition, it doesn't sort of help the civilizational patch that we're using sort of to come back on our feet, or at least to be in a status from which we can start rethinking and reacting, especially about our Catholic condition, spiritually wise. However, in these times, it was a matter of life and death for so many people. So you would literally go into the Comitatus, not necessarily to save your Zippe, but to try to establish a world order that was greater, in fact, than the Zippe itself. So you have the Zippe characterized by a deep reverence for common ancestors and the obligations and rights individuals hold towards their blood relatives. So you have also a chthonic dimension. You have, for example, in Germanic societies already, we're talking, say, from the times we document the Germans historically, meaning not archaeologically or just through historiography. I mean, these are already burying people. They are, at least at large, the sense is that the leaders would still be cremated to favor the family ascent, which is why you light up candles in church. It's the same identical thing. Again, let's stop this idiotic sense of thinking that Christianity, or what we call paganism, is not within the wake, at least in the Iranian element, of the great Catholic tradition. There is no contradiction in it, and I do understand that we need really lots of videos to make fully the doctrine clear, but I'm not going to limit myself in my lessons exactly for the fact that these notions cannot be understood simply in a video or two. You need hundreds of them to study them, especially in order to fully appreciate the actual deal. So this zipper word is, of course, very chthonic oriented. Again, it's connected with agriculture, with the communitarian life, families, people live together. We have this sort of more human, chthonic bonds connected with the idea that you're part of this blood, and so that's basically just determining you. And you sort of go back to the earth to a degree. Yes, you can have this youthful exploit, but at the end of the day, we die, and we do not really think that the average individual is capable to save himself through war. This is, again, incredibly important, because already by the Common Era, the same so-called pagan Germans had, of course, abandoned the idea that they could save themselves by themselves. Right? The sagas do not really show us because this is mostly about the attitude, right? The myths could say certain things, but separating almost hypostatically gods from men, right? You find in Beowulf and in other scattered references the fact that sometimes, right, the hero can defy his fate, for example. But as you know, in the tragic destiny of the Germanic hero, he's great and everything, but there is always something slightly wrong he does that, of course, is enough to make the Holy Ghost parting from him and being assassinated in the most also sort of infamous ways, which realistically depict the radically unstable German politics and also military system at this point. This continuous fluidity of warbands rising and falling, this almost demonic, surely etheric dimension, because as we've seen, that is needed. Let's say the anthropophagus animals, like that darker outlook that, of course, the crow, the wolf, etc. has. It's of course, like the Germans had the eagles, had the entire Indo-European pack, right? But tendentially, by attitude, they thought that darkness was sort of looming over them, and that things had already sort of been lost, because it was common knowledge, at least, that fourth age the Iron One would essentially bring to the end of everything. And as you know, the entire Germano-Norse mythology is soaked in this. Now, on the other hand, there is instead the hero that tends to break the order, or at least that hopes that barely and that's where the divinity is just sensed, and there is something we were discussing about even the relation between men that is that lives on. The Germans reinject into the post-Roman world regarding the nobility of the potential of the individual, where of course there is a rigid divide of worth, right? But the sense of being able to affirm one's own liberty, as far as what was in fact concerning the Romano-Germanic fullest sense of freedom, right? Because in theory, that could have brought, at least that liberty could have brought to freedom that belongs fully only to God, and that those who bore arms had the sort of status and capacity to trigger that possibility as far as their deeds were concerned, right? Something that other peoples had gradually even lost. So the respect for liberty that surely, in the West is the greatest, but by scale in the entire history of mankind, that wildly explains also such success. Again, not freedom, like lesser people paranoidly babble about from their condition of social, anthropological, mental, personal inferiority, because they perfectly know that they can never attain it. We're talking liberty, so the capacity of being like these warriors under a leader that ultimately is the divine nature, to cultivate themselves and to transfigure themselves step by step during this practice, because it takes time. You must recognize what a disgusting thing being a human being is to begin with, in order to appreciate how much you can rise through such self-sacrifice in holy combat that is the greatest honor and glory in the history of mankind. So that's the point. We find, opposite to the Zippa, the warrior society, which is also one of disciplines, not warrior in the sort of more disgusting warrioristic terminology that looks at this completely asinine definition that wants the good soldiers being essentially just warriors. No, right? You must have discipline and virtus in order to be a veritable killer and an imperium holder, right? If you're just a warrior, you rot under the heels of civilization, and I think we made it abundantly clear in the West. What really means being a warrior in this sense is pursuing actually virtue. We saw how the same Roman term virtus is practically the same concept of furor. As a matter of fact, that the same Romans applied to these more barbarian peoples that, however, differently from the Greeks, as everyone who has studied Latin literature knows, actually nourished a significant sympathy towards. The Romans liked the Celts, the Romans liked the Germans. They appreciated this capacity of, combative effort to the death that would not back down, even in front of, just like Maximus in Gladiator. Would you understand it, Quintus? Would I? Because would us say that someone is defeated to begin with, and even if you get killed, right? It really depends on how you get killed as well, and what you have accomplished in the process. This is why it was a spiritual, fatherly order, of course a godfatherly one, in which the warrior society gathers around a prince. Princeps is the term that the Romans used to describe the leaders of the Germanic warbands, comprising his followers and bodyguard comrades. You understand that there is an actual stratification within the same warband. Not everybody is actually equal in the warband, but there is some separation in the warband from the rest of the world, from the Zippa, that in this sense makes you equal in that condition as a starting pack. In German, this is referred to as Gefolgschaft, famously enough, so that's the equivalent of the Latin Comitatus, which has basically also etymologically the same concept ingrained, highlighting the... Actually, it should be precise. Etymologically, it's different, right? Gefolgschaft means like essentially the following, the retinue, right? So Comitatus etymologically stems from comus, but I mean, they all have within even the different etymology, the same principle at the basis. You're basically sharing this sacred military bond with your comrades. So we will have to talk about this for the for the Roman warbands that are really something, and that we can document. Unfortunately, we didn't have in the same time in history. That's why we say that we're so lucky for the Germans. People documenting this adequately for the Romans, but of course we have incredibly poignant, also archaeological evidence from that. Again, Google Valerius Publicola for that matter and see how they, these brothers in arms, in Mars, right? They incarnated this Indo-European legacy. In any case, it's interesting to notice that the term Gefolgschaft highlights the hierarchical relationship between leader and follower more than else, from an etymological point of view, which, of course, has to do also with the fact that when the term comes about in written form, of course, we're looking already at a feudal society of some sort, starting from the 6th century, or at least whenever the paradigm shift in the imperial Catholic balance had occurred already. Christianity had been affirmed. I mean, the world had failed to itself after the Roman Golden Era prophesied between the Bronze and so this revival between the Bronze and the Iron One. And so by that point, of course, we're looking at a clientelary society in which there were just very single individual powerful leaders and sort of poorer followers, right? This is not like it would have been at the time of Augustus, where still the Romans had in their legionary force like a sense of the fact of egalitarian bond between noblemen in arms, because as cives optimo jure, they were, right? You couldn't infringe upon their liberty as Roman citizens who had also reinforced their condition through this heavenly military mandate in the legions, and say, in fact, the much less stratified Germanic world, in which there was so few surplus that, in general, the leaders were way more challenged than they would be, say, in the time of Clovis. So, again, we're talking millennia, half of a millennium specifically from these examples, but say there's all a story that happens right across the millennia that unfortunately we can't document just to a certain extent. In fact, in Latin, the term Comitatus reflects a different emphasis, focusing on the horizontal relationships among equals, right? And so this stemmed from a sort of a closer balance to the Indo-European society that the Romans had by the time they start expressing literally such terms for us to document. The Germans, in this sense, arrived much later, and we find that the sense of retinue following that has already intended that there is a guy who's now aristocrat, the others have sort of lost in part their power. But also just to some extent, because you cannot argue that, say, the Viking world, that was the case. They were backwards, but in this sense they sort of lived more within that kind of individual relations. Bear in mind, there is a thought, a history of the spirit that changes. These peoples had once believed that there was a guy that could save himself by himself. By this time, they do not really believe it. They don't believe it already by the 6th century, or even half a millennium before. They don't believe it in the Viking era. There's just a hope, but it's the hope that all mankind has, and that is definitely not something happening frequently. Within the Comitatus, hierarchy and solidarity coexist, positioning the leader as the foremost among a society of equals, at least in that condition that we were thinking about before. There must be a leader, but this is considered as a first among equals, at least in theory. Then in practice, this hierarchy is necessary because we're talking humans, right? If these people had all been sort of equal, they would have been, because they would have been brought back to the one. Because you cannot, there's no such thing like equality if not in God, right? Because also you are complete within yourself at that point. So within the war bands, there was always such segmentation, corresponded to a tactical one. And also, of course, to one of social background, that this leader may stand out as the noblest, the most authoritative, the wealthiest, the bravest, or even a combination of these traits, because, again, the empire manifests in this way. We should recover the idea that, for example, beauty is a moral value, right? That there is an eugenetic principle behind. Of course, the somatic, at least, capacity, yes, of course, to get the imperium, that at least is greatly facilitated by physical superiority, for example. This man was also, for practical reasons, normally the oldest, because that's also what VODEN himself symbolizes, like the grizzled veteran that has acquired wisdom through all this bloodshed, and so is more advanced spiritually, but at least by human standards and the anthropomorphization, at least of VODEN, that of course was something considered in very different ways in antiquity, just like the Numen rather than the god, right, in the same Latin word, for example, really was. And thus, having aged, having actually decayed from a physical point of view, but being superior spiritually, and so just being able to command others, right, to manifest his imperium through such retinue. Etymologically, the terms seigneur and princeps, and you know how the first one, seigneur, right, is so crucial to the entire feudal order, convey such primacy and superiority in rank, while simultaneously indicating his qualitative similarity to his followers. They are within this different condition and nature that at least has made them start from the within from an equal standpoint. Thus, we talk of this first or principle among a group of equals sharing ideals and a way of life with them, and more, as we see from the Huskarls, for example, etymologically. The sense is that, as we've seen, there is not such divide actually within the warband by initiation. This should, at least in theory, work as a single being. And so everything is shared in an absolute sense, ideal. If that was actually total, it would be divine. But part of that divinity manifests through the empire, the power that this group has. Germanic warrior society, which fundamentally values familial connections, of course, also in this sense of leadership, the noble ones are considered to be the least decayed from the Aesir, you know, the entire story. Like in any other Indo-European society and beyond, models itself after the family organization. It fosters, for example, artificial bonds of fatherhood and brotherhood among its members. We saw the adoptio per arma. There are the blood brothers through the commixtio sanguinis, showing exactly that they are one biologically. So strong is the spiritual level involved in such ferocious discipline imposed on them within the Comitatus. Cultivating relationships that emerge from and are forged by wartime experiences is kind of obvious, very relatable. You can find it among any veteran, that maybe it's just a modern guy that doesn't even know what that means. Well, study ancient religion and history, you will find out quite clearly. In this context, while these connections may not originate from birth, from actual human birth, they remain palpable and are ritualistically expressed through these practices, such as the aforementioned commixtio sanguinis, and more. It is just a symbol, of course. Like it's not just, I don't know, we share blood through wounds. We are essentially pouring imperium, spirit, and force there. It's just like who officiates the rite puts the actual power in it. Otherwise, the rite is null, right? It's just the same Christian concept for which you can be absolved by the priest, but if you're not actually contrite and you haven't redeemed yourself, that absolution is null. Given such dynamics, the significance of ancient Germanic laws becomes even clearer, because part of the Comitatus practice was also transferred in the obvious degree this system would be ruled, right? Government contains a part of the Comitatus. The entire deal of citizenship for the Romans was connected with this. It's as if they had extended their warband to the world, right? Gradually through military service and sacrifice in combat, etc. So it was all within the heavenly glory of the Holy Ghost. These laws stipulated, for example, that women take the oath per pectus suum, so by their breast, while men were required to swear per arma sua. This is very famous. So what does that mean? Is that the zippa is the more chthonic, feminine, telluric system, ideally. Of course, it's not that they were, they were rigidly patriarchal societies, of course, but because these elements compenetrate one another, they are warlike people, and the men do not swear on their own heart themselves, but on their own arms. Why? Because everybody knows that, right, from the Durandal, that Roland cries for while he's dying, not thinking even about his woman, because the Durandal is the heavenly glory herself, is the transfigured force of hell that, thanks to the hero's sacrifice, has transfigured into the heavenly maiden that will bring him to the sky. So the sword is the alter ego of the warrior himself. Ideally, this should be of a material that never perishes. Also, that's why the enormous cost of the swords in the societies, and the sense of how much really dependent on them, and of the legend revolving around magic swords, etc. That's the actual so-called magic. It's all imperial power. It's heavenly glory. So, in other words, men belonged to another dimension. This also, for example, you find, I don't know, in the Longobard graves on the Elbe River, separated cemeteries of men and women respectively, because the men had, and we know a few, unfortunately, concrete terms within those societies, because they weren't, of course, writing, but also when they would do that later, had changed themselves over the centuries, would probably devote themselves to a collective degree to the military, and as such they did not belong to the Zippa anymore. So the contrasting relationship between the Zippa and the Comitatus has deep, also historical roots, likely stemming from the prehistoric religious, also the Indo-European invasion, the reformation of the heavenly element in Europe, that these people had really achieved and never forgotten in the millennia that had passed, where they had, as we've seen, sort of become a hybrid with local chthonic elements. And this is particularly evident again in these worlds. This upheaval led to the decline of the ancient chthonic deities venerated by the pre-Germans, in the sense known as the Vani, of course, who were associated with ancestor worship and familial solidarity. The great Bronze Age civilization in today's Serbia of the mother, living this communistic spaces of promiscuity with female dominance, is wiped out by the Indo-European virile heavenly invasions. Of course, their place had arisen the new Indo-European dynasties and deities. So the Aesir, because they were basically the same thing, representing heroic and solar morality. This perspective, though one that merits some reservation regarding the fact that also the Indo-Europeans originally had this commixtion of values, but naturally to a very different degree compared especially to the cemeteries, positions the Vannic system of the Sippe in opposition to the Esic one of the Comitatus. The example stems from VODEN, adventurer, protector of warriors, and maintain this Numan character of mystery in its manifestation. According to a myth derived from the Norwegian tradition, Odin, before his death, reportedly wounded himself with a spear, encouraging his followers to do the same, as the ultimate proof of absolute loyalty to the enterprise. This is the Ynglinga Saga 9. Such practice gave rise to various customs, such as the infliction of ritual wounds during initiations and the tradition of dying with weapons in hand. This was already true since the Indo-European times. We trace it sort of as a prehistoric evidence from the various references, like in this case. Ritual wounds were likely present, if not exclusively, at least during the rite of passage described by Tacitus, which transformed a young man receiving weapons into a warrior and thus a free man. Right? All over the world, we know from primitive peoples that this is exactly what happens. Think about the Nur in Sudan. I mean, the idea is that these people can literally die if they're not enough during the initiation, right? And this would be exactly the same. It would be incredibly vexed also later, abused, again, all the most indescribable kind of violence beyond any kind of order whatsoever that symbolized that state of hell out of which you have to come out with your own forces only, or die, because otherwise you would be useless in combat. That's the deepest meaning of the legal condition of a freeman, conventionally meant in these societies. That's why it's so important. In order to be a freeman in the Indo-European world, legally, etc., among the Romans, the Germans, etc., you must have passed through that standard of virility that has transfigured you through arms to be something conditionally separated from the rest of the community in order to lord over it. That's what confers your rights as pater familias, for example. And so the right of life or death on your family members. And because behind this, there is a military principle. It's a martial law. It all derives from that. You wonder why Romulus, the entire legion, the Roman foundation with the wolf, etc. We talked about this in multiple videos, one in particular dedicated to it. That's where the stock of heroes stems from. There is not another human condition that allows you for simply be that. You must prove that, right? This is a very beautiful thing. I mean, first of all, you're not technically even a human. I mean, human is this, in fact, literally dirty. I mean, that's what human, from humans, means condition. It has nothing to do with manhood. Manhood is superior to humanity. Right? It's a completely different concept that all these peoples share. This practice was certainly observed, particularly during the initiation rites into certain secrets, such as the military Männerbund, as they're called, or societies of men, about which we unfortunately know very little, although numerous signs attest to their existence and being the single most radically and traumatically violent thing you can imagine. And of course, like it's sort of disgusting, by the way, how this sort of pseudo illiterate, ridiculously self-styled neo-pagans are always whining like schoolgirls about the fact, oh my god, the Romans were evil because they said that the Celts made human sacrifices. It was not true. That was their primary identity. Human sacrifice is the primary identity of being a Celt, being a Gaul. Do you know what a Gaul means? Do you know what that etymologically is connected to the warband? What a Gaul is? You know, if you do not even know this, your ancestors would have butchered you to pieces, because, let's be honest, that's the thing. We should stop pretending that humanity per se has at least the value that we have given to it conventionally in our world. Also because there are such people speaking in this way. So this would be just alone the greater reason. Study history. Don't be lesser people. The world does not need lesser people. It never did and never will. Get over it. So a young man admitted to the warrior society was thus simultaneously enabled on a ritual level to join the Einherjar, the friends and chosen followers of VODEN Odin, the eternal warrior Comitatus. Watch my video about the doctrine of the two natures and understand what the eternal warrior Comitatus is. The Romans said vivere militare est. Translate what it means. Snorri Sturluson's Edda specifically mentions those privileged, deceased, who ascend to heaven to join Odin as friends, and not again the average lesser people stepping on a mine and blowing himself up like a moron. We're talking here heroes, people who manage to transcend to a remarkable extent, at least, because fully they would be really Odin himself. They're human and therefore subnormal condition. Others remain bound to the earth. Instead, the same soldiers that die, hidden in the soil. Right? This is the beauty of it. And then passing away, like literally as their soul would roam the earth, their mortal souls roaming the earth for a while and then dissolving. Right? At best functioning somatically to fertilize the fields that beautifully, as ironically, will be plowed by the same lesser elements of society, the ones of the Zippe that, yes, can go to war sometimes, but eventually are just farmers. And yes, they have slaves, but they work. And only fourth estaters, which is formerly slaves in the traditional doctrine of the case, this work, right? The true noblemen are the ones who have somebody else who works for them in virtue of their imperium. This is true for the Roman citizens, this is true for the Germanic Comitatus members. They are a caste separated from the rest of society in virtue of the fact that they are free as noblemen. This is something that would continue in the Romano-Germanic tradition, for example, in the communes, the idea of the citizens in arms. And this is something that must be cultivated as a hallmark of Western civilizational superiority. That's how the West had colonies. That's how the world revolves around the West. And there is nothing that can be done to unhinge it. The condition of the celestial heroes relates to, of course, to the divine dimension of the Aesir, whereas the status of the dead aligns with the banner and their nurturing. Conservative roles associated with the cult of the Mother Earth. Those who sacrifice themselves into holy combat and manage to transcend their human dimension get their place in the firmament. Those who can't will be swallowed by the deities of the underworld and constantly molded, chewed, digested, and respite in their human dimension, destined to degenerate out of existence. Indeed, the ultimate resting place of the non-heroes is the underground kingdom of El, whose names shares roots, by the way, with the Latin celare, which means to hide. Remember, this hell means that you disappear, essentially. And see how radical the Indo-European roots across Europe really are. Remember those Blut und Boden. Blut und Boden are somatic and telluric symbolisms, where you can transcend, you can be nurtured through them. You can elevate yourself from them, but your entire purpose is to transcend them, right? There is not such thing like considering the world in non-Catholic ways. If you don't, you fail and you go under where you belong, right? And so when you look at the banners, religious traditions predating those of the Aesir, the two afterlife concepts do not really exist in a relationship of chronological precedence. This is really a Catholic condition. Either you're in or you're out. Either you belong to the Comitatus or to the ZIP. Yet, as we were just saying regarding Blut und Boden, they are in functional complementarity. If anything, because, at least in the doctrine of the two natures, the divine nature never changes, is never altered. So what actually humans are doing, because that's what concerns us, is to return to the within the divine nature. And the Comitatus is that dimension. So you cannot but elevate yourself through your own forces that belong to the human nature in order to be reaccepted into the heavenly one, if you can. So we'll also soon observe that within the Zippa, the cult remains connected to the chthonic forces that link the living with their ancestors and fertility, that are necessary for humans to exist in the first place, to perpetuate their existence, albeit degrading themselves without in the absence of this spiritual capacity of transcending their nature through this heroic effort. In all this, consider how the same humans had degenerated to the point of finding, for example, in the famous saga of Aldingus, Valhall itself depicted as an underground kingdom, as the name suggests. So the etymology there in the European term is the same as we've seen, of hiding, disappearing. So reflect on how actually dark before, especially the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle to evangelization, and in fact to the rise of the Germans to the imperial authority, these peoples were into, right, at the margins of the world, in obscurity, in perpetual damnation before they were redeemed in their imperial Catholic power. It is evident that the cleric who authored the saga, while attempting to depict Germanic pagan afterlife in infernal terms and simultaneously drawing comparison with the Latin inferno, likely exerted some influence in this regard. But indeed, the sense of a world that is not purely heavenly, and the fact that these peoples had forgotten the possibility of but a single person to save the world, without thinking to be able to do it by themselves, shows the greater human condition that by this point in history we had collectively fallen into. In all this, consider how the same humans had degenerated to the point of finding, for example, in the famous saga of Aldingus, Valhall itself depicted as an underground kingdom, as the name suggests. So the etymology there in the European term is the same as we've seen, of hiding, disappearing. So reflect on how actually dark before, especially the Germanic Imperial Catholic miracle to evangelization, and in fact to the rise of the Germans to the imperial authority, these peoples were into, right, at the margins of the world, in obscurity, in perpetual damnation before they were redeemed in their imperial Catholic power. It is evident that the cleric who authored the saga while attempting to depict Germanic pagan afterlife in infernal terms and simultaneously drawing comparisons with the Latin inferno likely exerted some influence in this regard. But indeed, the sense of a world that is not purely heavenly, and the fact that these peoples had forgotten the possibility of but a single person to save the world without thinking to be able to do it by themselves, shows the greater human condition that by this point in history we had collectively fallen into. The example of such Comitatus originates from VODEN himself. VODEN would set the example. Just as VODEN was surrounded by a Gefolgschaft, an entourage of brave men, every Germanic leader, whether of noble lineage or simply a particularly courageous warrior, sought to emulate the divine and attract companions worthy of their stature. That's where properly the concept of household troops would stem from. This is also how these more chthonic Zippe-like ideals of halls and of tables, of roofs, of course in a humanized symbology would project like the Valhalla to some degree, while the concept, of course, pretty close to the time these Germans were brought down by Charlemagne, for example, in Saxony, or also they gradually converted to Christianity by themselves in Scandinavia, would be familiar with. Also because their mental structures had not been so spoiled, so changed also by the same development, not by this more attuned sense that they couldn't quite succeed as humans anymore, had already kicked in, at least before they were given the hope that a great leader giving them the possibility of entering his comitatus could make them contribute to achieve that for themselves and the world, and also their own Zippe. There is this deep tension also in the medieval knight between the bloodshed, the complete habituation to killing en masse, and the breaking down at the songs of angelic women that reminded them of their mothers, of their sisters that had left when they were children and had likely died of labor. By that point, really would arrive to their ears. There is something radical in this divide. The fact that you have to renounce literally to this world in order to elevate yourself, to rule it, for saving those who can't do it by themselves, who are in it, women, children, those elderly that haven't made it. You're the hope of your world. This is what the defensive, the protective, victorious role of the knight is. Such leaders often looked beyond the confines of their tribes in the early Germanic world, either summoning individuals or traveling great distances to assemble a new cohort, a community that transcended tribal affiliations, composed solely of those loyal to him and unencumbered by the conflicting allegiances of the foreign territories in which they operated. That's how, in many ways, they were sort of outlaws, right? They were contractors, they were private soldiers. The idea being that the greater your fame, the more distant the places from which people would come to serve you, and as a consequence, the finest men. And there was no greater honor but being the leader of such men. There is also a migratory point in this, all, from the Italic tradition of the Vers Sacrum and just the Indo-European Steppenwolf kind of totemic advance that, of course, part of this men, especially probably in the more archaic times, were properly expelled as an initiatory practice by their own communities to become warriors because they could not be fed, and so they had either to conquer and die. Their ultimate purpose being killing their enemies, getting their women, and in a sense settling down, creating a new order that would hopefully be as large as the one of their glory, their conquest. So this great objective of dominating the world through their Catholic signory. Consequently, elites of warriors emerged within the Germanic world at some point. I mean, this is true for every place, from this tribally warlike context, accustomed to traversing the various political boundaries and refusing to be limited by their immediate familial contexts that were seen, remember, in a Bannic sense as a proof of weakness, of sensitivity, of emotion that were not what the ultimate purpose of the leader was. Indeed, one might describe them as warrior internationals, exactly for the fact that they had to be detached from their own houses. This is exactly, as I was hinting at before, what, for example, in Celtic, Gael means. It means foreigner. And the fact that you have an entire country like Gaul taking the name after that, plus others, of course, shows you the point. These men were foreigners in their own land, at least if you consider the Gauls as a nation, then realizing like the Gallo-Glaic, so that's the same tradition of war bands, right? Of mercenary war bands that had to roam around and create new lordships and identifying within the divine of the two natures, exactly because they were strangers to this world, this fallen world to begin with, by the sacred bonds that had taken with divinity. In illuminating this phenomenon, we find guidance in the words of Caesar and Tacitus, of course. Caesar, Kaiser, highlights warriors who have forsaken their villages across the diverse regions of Germany to rally in service of Ariovistus. We were talking about him in the video about the boy, by the way, because Ariovistus is actually a Celtic name, but it contains actually the same roots of the Germanic etymology, which is basically the same word, Arius, which is noble, Aryan, and Visus in Celtic and Visos in Germanic, which means wise. So it's the idea that he was a wise nobleman because he was a leader of men in this kind. And that's exactly what Caesar is talking about. In fact, these warriors have severed their ties with their own people just to follow him, setting aside the alternating demands of agriculture, military duty to others that would treat them just as levies, to dedicate themselves instead entirely to the pursuit of war as higher status warriors. Tacitus, on the other hand, introduces us to restless individuals with a bellicose spirit, for whom the peaceful life of the Sippe, dedicated to farming, tending livestock, and nurturing the fertile earth where their ancestors rest, is insufficient. It's not to say that to these men ancestors were not important, but they wouldn't be in the moment that they entered the Comitatus. Their ancestors rest, yes, but they rest in the dirt. As we will see in other videos, of course, there are different souls, right? It's believed that in part, at least for some of these local Sippe dwellers that had fallen in combat, there had been a sort of firmament offshoot. But most of them rest into the ground where they're gonna stay, right? And they can also For example, in the Celtic, in the Irish tradition, you have all these mounds of warriors present pretty much everywhere. Think about the kurgans, etc., that in a sense can emanate almost as reliquaries, as sacred sepulchres, magically loaded somas, certain power that can help for this broader transfiguration. But it's so meager that only reactivating, of course, your own life into this higher condition can positively make it. Also for the Zippa, this is the most important aspect of the story. And Tacitus stresses, of course, this idea that someone must do something about their lives to begin with. So it's an ambition. It's telling us very beautifully how, of course, we can't be satisfied materially, but we all know it doesn't end there. They're actually just buying a bit of comfort before things get dire, and we haven't maybe just accomplished enough. Tacitus tells us that these men harbored no fondness for work or peace. They're enemies of them. The latter in particular are seen as synonymous with tedious idleness. Their only joy is found in warfare. Just like those Germanic chieftains that have fun by having naked youth running to spears and seeing how many of them die and how many actually succeed. Because that was the point, rolling the dice, seeing which was the best. Familiarizing with the concept of human sacrifice in order to rejuvenate the race. When unable to find this excitement at home, they wander to distant realms, Tacitus says, responding to the call of a distinguished leader. Right? If you're interested in the references, of course, speaking Caesar, that's the Commentary de Bello Gallico 136.7 and 414, while Tacitus is Germania 15. With these individuals and their new motivations, a trend emerges that threatens to erode the traditional, now sedentary and self-sufficient civilization of the Zippa. The Zippa has a power on its own. The Romans themselves feared the Etruscan Aruspicus, but as heroes they had to go beyond, because the same underworld is populated of forces. They're inferior, yes, but they are still present. They're actually big. Otherwise, the Olympian gods and the netherworlders, just like the Aesir against the Vanir, would have not fought, would have not clashed to establish that order. That reflects the wide bloodshed and destruction that the Indo-European conquest had brought because of the local resistance. New aspirations and emotions rose to prominence: ambition, the desire for distinction and authority, a longing for adventure, a quest for wealth, an appetite for excitement, and a discontent with the monotonous life defined by humble, customary tasks. You understand how in all these motivations there is a chthonic component. There cannot be in a human nature. The hope is to transcend this. But it is also the reason why in the Germanic sagas you always find this capriciously tragic end of the hero, because who are you actually to claim that you can succeed? This is also the point that the church will make. Yes, you want to be an emperor, be it, and show us that you can resist this motherly force that you want to detach yourself from. Successful. If not, there's something wrong. But the two aspects must always be compenetrated, because there is no one without the other. Though tribal existence may be shaped by the capricious forces of fate, people are beginning to challenge this notion, and or at least to remember that that was the case. Tacitus, when discussing the peculiar captive warriors settled along the upper course of the Weser, notes how they are accustomed to fortunam inter dubia, virtutem inter certa numerare. Germania 30th, which means Fate, if not entirely controllable, need not to be passively awaited or accepted. It is neither unyielding nor relentless until it reaches its conclusion. This is the most obvious Catholic principle. Fate, yes, is a big deal. The Saint Germans, as we were saying before, were starting to properly anthropomorphize it through the norms, but in the sense properly that there is this life that has already been cut, adjusted for you. This is not, however, what the original principle is. This is more like saying, look, that fate is very powerful, and that as humans we have started losing because of the lack of standards. As a consequence, there must be someone who at least can challenge this, right? It can still show that fate can be confronted, that fear is our greatest enemy, if anything. And that's the entire, in fact, principle of self-sacrifice in holy combat, that is selfless, that looks at not just at the individual, but the collective element. I've met this other, again, sort of neo-pagans who believe that, I don't know, being God means to do literally whatever you want, as if there wasn't an absolute perfection, as if just say that will entail to do whatever, and that self-sacrificing for the world in itself would be just, I don't know, some sort of strange Judaic Christian legacy of alleged weakness or, subjugation to somebody else's will, right? Of course, everything is all about self-sacrifice and reaching absolute unity, and not just being an anthropomorphized god of the legions of the later period that roams around doing weird stuff, right? So it's incredibly strange, again, how neo-pagans in their also explicit anti-Judaism feel so hysterically threatened by people that they consider inferior. Like that's the first indicator that you are a lesser person, that you are living into a superstition. I don't need to add anything. What is certain, and upon which one can rely and act with confidence, is the courage of the warrior, a value that was instilled from childhood among these people. And consider, for example, as late as Sidonius Apollinaris, that, for example, that the courage of the Franks was something to be sung, also, and obviously, of course, in a Christian sense. So I think that we must really start to be extremely serious about what this entire thing of Schwerpunkt is, right? I know that nobody talks ever about these topics, especially in the terms I do. Let's do this. Let's take over, and let's stop wasting time with nonsense. This stuff must be told. This stuff must be taught. This stuff must be learned. Because without it, there is no victory and no world domination. And there is no point in living without it. For today, however, I stop it here. We will talk, of course, a lot about the Germanic Comitatus further. If you did like this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.